Princess Brianna was proceeding to the throne room as she was summoned by her mother. A messenger was sent to the royal apartments, which lightly spoke to her mother's intentions for their meeting. The city watch opened the heavy doors as her footsteps echoed throughout the empty, vast throne room. Brianna dressed simply, much like her father. Green and gray silk, leather pants, and low-heeled boots were typical for a training session. As she approached the Iron Throne, she recognized her mother confidently seated and awaiting her daughter. The throne now was significantly different than the stories that described it prior to the Great War. She was raised on the stories of her mother's mission here, riding a dragon alongside her uncle and father, and nearly being burned to death for her troubles. The remnants of the Great War were memorialized in steel to create the high back of the Iron Throne. Each of the 7 weapons used in the trial by 7 were copied, and now formed the backrest of the large steel chair. The centerpiece was the long warhammer wielded by the smith. Surrounding the hammer were the Valyrian steel twins, Oathbreaker and Widow's Wail, that were wielded by the mother and father. Longclaw and Blackfire were next, both possessed by the Norseman's warrior and stranger. Finally, on the edge of the backrest was Heartsbane, and a copy of her mother's sword, Needle. It was just so happened this very sword rested on Brianna's hip, as she approached her mother, who was seated on her father's throne.
You're late.
Arya said coldly.
Sword, staff, or dagger?
Asked Brianna, now matching her mother's coldness.
Staff.
Arya replied simply. She removed her scabbard, containing Needle, and leaned it against one of the throne room's many pillars. Arya had left her daughter's staff against that same pillar. She grasped it and began spinning it through her fingers on her dominant hand.
You've forgotten your helm.
Chastised Arya with a slight grin.
I don't need a...
Shouted Brianna. Her outburst was interrupted by Arya's unprovoked attack. Shireen immediately parried her mother's lightning-quick strikes as she was in full retreat. Once 4 or 5 steps into that retreat, the staffs struck each other. Arya's words enunciated with each quick strike.
Suit yourself.
Brianna grew irritated at her mother's taunts. They were commonplace as their training was not just physical, but mental as well. Finally, Brianna was able to set her footing as her mother anticipated this, and struck her midsection with the center of her staff in between her wide grips. Brianna slightly coughed, trying to regain her wind, but she remained on the defensive. Precious air finally started to fill her collapsed lungs while she prepared for another attack. The fact that she was temporarily stunned did not relieve her of her defensive posture. If Brianna seemed to expect the slightest mercy, she would pay for that assumption dearly. Minutes swept by and neither mother nor daughter spoke. Just the sound of staffs striking each other, and the occasional grunt. Arya had slowed her offensive measures, and Brianna thought to capitalize. Arya attempted a horizontal swipe, just as Brianna had expected. She lowered herself to a flat spin and singled up her grip to extend the reach of her weapon. The single swipe, if too low, would break her mother's ankle. If she could strike her calf, it would likely take her mother off her feet. As her attempt was halfway to her mother's leg, Arya leapt to avoid the strike. What Brianna saw next she wasn't prepared for. As Arya leapt to avoid the strike, she cartwheeled as her feet left the floor. She never loosened her grip on her weapon, as the butt of the staff was the only part touching the ground, as Arya used this as leverage to right herself from the inverted position. Brianna's mouth hung open as the butt of Arya's staff left the ground, and was quickly uprighted to simply and gently close her daughter's mouth from underneath her jaw. The two ladies laughed as it was silently agreed upon that the training session was over. Brianna rubbed her sore jaw as her mother's staff had connected to it at least twice. Brianna noticed a small amount of blood on her hand as her lip had started to swell.
You drew blood this time.
Brianna claimed, wiping her mouth with the back of her sleeve.
I pulled up before contact.
Arya responded as she turned her back to proceed back to the steps leading to the throne.
You've been saying that since I was 7, yet you seem to hit harder each time.
Brianna responded defiantly.
So you've had 8 additional years to get stronger.
Arya said with a smile. Blood had now dripped onto the gray wolf embroidered onto her daughter's blouse. Arya noticed this and silently notified her daughter.
I would have appreciated this kind of training when I was young. You remember you volunteered for this.
Arya reminded her daughter, and Brianna sighed heavily.
I do, and I do appreciate it. I can't help but think you enjoy this too much.
Brianna admitted. This comment stopped Arya in her tracks, and she turned to face her daughter. Arya's scarred face was inches from her daughter's when she made her admission.
I do enjoy training you. I enjoy the fact that my daughter will never have to endure something she does not elect to.
Arya admitted. Brianna had no retort for this. She knew her mother meant well, but she couldn't help feeling like a whipping post sometimes.
Why do you continue to wear the Stark sigil? You're a Baratheon, as I've told you before.
Arya lamented, with a softness Brianna wasn't used to hearing.
I'm only named Baratheon due to a royal decree.
Brianna admitted, with a tone of bitterness.
Others have a different name for me. You must have heard.
Brianna asked.
I've only ever heard it once. They don't speak much anymore.
Arya retorted reluctantly.
Well, the bastard princess has a nice ring to it.
Brianna retorted. She knew she had disarmed her mother. It was a topic she wanted to breach for a long time. It was the very reason she wears the gray wolf sigil of House Stark. When Arya retorted, she did so carefully.
I was born to be a lady, though I never became one. And if I was never a lady, I could never be a queen.
Arya then continued.
I love your father. I always have. But I'll never be forced to be anything I'm not.
Arya sighed heavily.
No amount of blood or bruises can teach you that lesson.
Arya finished. Brianna could never understand her mother's stubbornness regarding her lack of marriage to her father. How is it that she, a princess, could be shipped off to the Reach or Dorne, then be forced to enter a marriage just because her father was an unmarried king? This had frustrated Brianna for years, and had been the topic of many conversations. She knew at the very least that her father would negotiate a good match. Brianna felt attractive, slender, tall, deep black hair, and green eyes that covered the mind of a warrior. She was born in the Red Keep just months after the Battle for the Dawn. Her mother carried her through many of the battles, and she was unlikely to even be here if not for her mother's lifetime of training.
Please wear your dress for dinner tonight. Your father wants your opinion on a few matters.
Arya asked of her daughter. Brianna shrugged at the thought of being told what to do, but as a princess she had become accustomed to it. The royal apartments were still flooded with the shouts of the many peasants contesting the selection process to the expanded council. Brianna entered the dining chamber, with her mother's direwolf Nymeria closely in tow. The king and princess's mother had already taken their seats. "You look lovely this evening, my daughter," beamed King Gendry as he took his seat. The Red Keep servants had begun their first course. Brianna couldn't help but think of the many common folk bedding down this evening with empty bellies due to the ongoing drought. She knew her father rejected the lavish lifestyle of their grandfather, King Robert Baratheon, but she could never speak as to the feeling of hunger. King Gendry commented on her swollen lower lip, and Arya gave a brief overview of their earlier training session. As the first course was served, her father claimed a hold on the conversation. "I wanted to address the issue of your courtship and betrothal." Gendry smiled, probably thinking she would be excited at the prospect. Brianna just lightly picked at her food and gave the occasional eye contact and charming smile at her father as he stumbled on. She assumed there was a discussion behind closed doors on when and how to broach this topic. Brianna knew her mother was expecting an outburst. How could the Lady Arya force her daughter to marry when she, herself, had always refused the custom? She could feel her mother stare as she listened to her father's words. All the while she remained silent. "We intend to have you tour the Stormlands and meet with their lords and heirs. Might there be one to your liking?" King Gendry smiled. Brianna was being given a choice on the matter. The expectations set upon her as heir to the Iron Throne were never in doubt. However, the fact that the daughter would wed before the mother was never expected by lords outside of this dining room. Arya's lack of effort to change the subject revealed her mother's intentions. Arya must have wanted Brianna to broach the subject. Events always seem to unravel just as her mother wants them to. Brianna refused to be predictable, and refused to contest, at this time. Nothing her father said was even worth remembering. He hadn't properly prepared himself, again just as Arya had probably designed. The only thing the king had properly communicated was his nervousness over the issue at hand. This, and this only, was the only idea Arya had wished to impress on Brianna. "Maybe it'll be another 15 years before I broach the subject again," Brianna thought to herself.